Hi, I'm Mark from Kicker, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how the Flop Player Pool Tendencies feature within Kicker software works. So this is how you select it from the main screen. It's here in the middle of the bottom. We've currently got about 1.8 million hands filtered from my hand histories. So if we come in, this is what it looks like when you first come in. We've got a green filter here, and at the moment that's the only filter that's applied. And actually, there isn't a filter being applied at the moment. It's just any and all hands are being included here. And what this screen is telling us is, first of all, there's 194,000 hands out of the 1.8 million where two players got to a flop and a player continuation betted, and the other player was in a position where they had to determine whether they were going to call, raise or fold. And this is showing what those tendencies of those players are at different bet sizes. So anywhere between 0 and 20% of pot, 20 to 40%, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 99, and 99% plus. The reason it's 99% plus is just to catch those times when there are slight rounding errors on pot size bets, but basically that's a pot size bet plus. And you can see the frequency with which players are calling, raising and folding based on the bet size range that has been chosen by the player making the continuation bet. So this is just by looking at one filter. What I find most useful with this feature is the ability to add a second filter. Just before I do, I'm just going to point out that we've restricted this to the minimum and maximum effective stack sizes being at least 30 and the maximum of 500. We're looking at the minimum number of positions being 6, as in there were at least 6 players at the start of the hand, and the minimum number of hands per bar is 50. So we've set it so that if across the 3 bars vertically in this graph the number of hands drops below 50, we just remove it from the graph because it's dropped below a reasonable level of statistical significance. And you can change this. You can set this to whatever you want. You can set it to 100, 200, 1,000, whatever you think is a reasonable number for statistical significance. You can set that. I'm going to add a second filter now. Hit refresh. And now what we're doing is we're comparing a filter, the green filter, with an orange filter. At the moment, both filters are just set to not actually have any filters at all. It's literally all of the hands. So again, we're just seeing a kind of duplication of what we just saw. And it's the kind of thing you'd expect to see, that the higher the bet size, the less frequently players are calling, and the more often they're folding, and also the less often they're raising. But what we can do is, and what I find most useful here, is we can compare and contrast. So we can try and spot patterns in behaviour. So for example, what if the aggressor is in position versus the times when the aggressor is out of position? And if we hit refresh, you can see that you start to see the differences here. So, you know, at a bet size of between 20 and 40%, when the aggressor is in position, they're going to get called 52% of the time, but when the aggressor is out of position, they're getting called 55% of the time. And it's even more stark here when the bet size is between 60 and 80% of pot. They're only getting called 41% of the time when the aggressor is in position, whereas they're getting called 47% of the time when the aggressor is out of position. And the sort of thing this is useful for is when you're on the flop, and let's say you've made a continuation bet and you've been called, it just gives you an idea. If you don't have any reads on the player, using the player pool information, you can have a rough idea of how often players are making those calls, and therefore you can take whatever pre-flop range you were putting them on, and you can have a rough idea that they're probably carrying on about 47% of the time. They're calling 47% of the time, and therefore you can start trying to work out what types of hands they might do that with. If I just clear these filters again, and let's have a look at another difference. Let's say we're looking at when the flop includes an ace versus when the flop excludes an ace, and have a look. And again, you can see the kinds of differences that you have when there's an ace versus not an ace. So, for example, you can see that when there's an ace on the flop, and you bet between 40 and 60% pot, you get folds 47% of the time. When there isn't an ace on the flop, you only get folds 42% of the time. So again, there's a bit of a difference there. And this kind of information might help you to inform what bet sizes you're going to use under certain circumstances. You can go much more detailed on this. You can add all kinds of filters here. So you can say, for example, that the flushing status is a flush draw, and the straighting status is that there's a straight draw, and you can say that it also includes an ace. And then you could compare that with just a general unfiltered situation. So we hit the refresh there, and you can see the reason why those bars have disappeared is because there's fewer than 50 of them, so they just get eliminated from the graph. But you can see that you've got this information here, and you can compare and contrast the different scenarios. You can, if you want, go even more detailed than this. So if we clear both of these filters, let's say we want to look at situations where the aggressor was on the button and the defender was in the small blind. Compare that with the times when the aggressor was on the button and the defender was in the big blind. And you can do that. And here you can start to see the differences between how the small blind and the big blind respond. And you can add as many of these filters as you like. Obviously, the more filters you add, the more the sample size is going to reduce. But there may well be spots that you want to look at that mean that you wanted to look at flushing status and straighting status and what the flop included and whether it was paired and so on and so forth, and maybe whether the aggressor was in or out of position. The Broadway filter here just says how many Broadway cards there were. If that's set to -1, that just means we're not interested in how many Broadway cards there were, and you can set it for anywhere between 0 and 3. And obviously, as you can see, once we've got this level of filtering where it's button versus small blind and there were 3 Broadway cards on the flop, suddenly you've got quite a small sample size. You've only got 351 hands, and quite a lot of these disappear, but you've still got some information about the most common bet sizes, but statistically that's probably not a significant enough number for you to be able to draw many conclusions. So you do have to pick and choose which filters you apply. I'm just going to clear both of these. One final thing is you can actually change these ranges here. By default, they're set to be between 0 and 20, 20 and 40, 40 and 60, 60 and 80, and 80 and 99, as we saw at the start. But you can actually come in here. Let's say you wanted to look at, you were particularly interested in looking at between 45 and 55%, because they were the more sort of typical bet sizes at the levels you play. Then there's nothing to stop you doing that. You just hit refresh, and you can see that suddenly here we're looking at between 45 and 55, and a knock-on effect of that is that here we're looking at between 20 and 45, and here we're looking at between 55 and 80. But if that's the bet size you're interested in, you can manipulate these ranges to make it like that, and that then applies across all 3 of these different graphs, the call, the raise, and the fold graphs. So you can manipulate this with filters and with bet size ranges pretty much to whatever extent you like in order to try and determine flop player pool tendencies. One final thing on this screen, you can reach this screen when you're using the scenario analyzer. Once you're on the flop, it will give you the opportunity, when it's relevant, for you to be able to click a button to come to this screen and do some of this analysis, which will then enable you to go straight back to the scenario with some information about what kind of frequencies you might expect to see given board textures and so on, because it will take the texture from the board, from the scenario you're analysing, and it will have a stab at populating these filters using the texture that has been applied. But you'll be able to see that in another video that's available on the scenario analyzer.